On the morning of April 12, 1966, as the humid air above northern Vietnam shimmered with heat, a quiet sense of anticipation settled inside a concrete command bunker near Hanoi. Soviet advisors, men who had spent years shaping air combat theory in classrooms near Moscow, stood shoulder to shoulder with North Vietnamese officers, staring at radar scopes that glowed an ominous green. This was not a training exercise. This was real. For the first time, the sleek delta-wing MiG-21 would face a Western lightweight fighter lineage that would eventually culminate in the F-5E Tiger II. The Soviet men felt a mixture of pride and dread. Pride that their aircraft was finally being tested, dread that war is a habit of humiliating theory. Colonel Sergei Ivanovich Melnikov, a veteran advisor who had flown MiGs during Cold War intercept drills, scribbled a note into his leather-bound journal. "Today, the West will test us without knowing it." His voice, calm on the outside, masked a deeper tension. Would Soviet doctrine, high-speed interception, strict ground control, short, brutal engagements, hold up against agile Western fighters flown with more autonomy? As engines roared to life on distant runways, one question hung in the air. What happens when classroom certainty meets the chaos of combat? By 1967, the conflict had matured into a deadly laboratory. Soviet advisors rotated quietly through Vietnamese air bases like Phuoc Yên Air Base, officially listed as technical consultants, but in reality acting as silent observers of history. The MiG-21 pilots they trained were young, disciplined, and fiercely patriotic, but often restricted by rigid rules of engagement. Across the region, Western-aligned forces were experimenting with lighter, more agile aircraft concepts, ideas that would later be embodied perfectly by the F-5E Tiger II. Though the F-5E itself would see extensive combat later, its philosophy, simplicity, agility, pilot freedom, was already clashing ideologically with Soviet thinking. Lieutenant Nguyen Van Cock, one of North Vietnam's top aces, later recalled an advisor warning him, "Speed is life. Do not turn. Strike once and disappear." But combat had other plans. Dogfights dissolved into chaotic turning battles, missile shots missed, cannons jammed, and suddenly MiG pilots were forced into close-range fights Soviet doctrine discouraged. Advisors watched in silence as radar vectors broke down and pilots made split-second decisions without ground control. Some Soviet officers felt admiration. Others felt alarm. One whispered to another, "If they survive by disobeying us, what does that say about our rules?" Viewer question: if you were a pilot, would you trust doctrine or your instincts? The emotional toll on Soviet advisors grew heavier with each sortie. By March 1968, after months of combat analysis, reports sent back to Moscow carried a noticeably different tone. Gone was the confident language of superiority. In its place appeared phrases like unexpected maneuverability and pilot adaptability. Western light fighters, especially those in the F-5 family, were not winning through raw power, but through flexibility. Advisors such as Major Alexei Varnin, a former test pilot, wrote bluntly, "Our aircraft is faster. Their aircraft is freer." Watching Vietnamese pilots forced into visual dogfights against nimble opponents revealed an uncomfortable truth. Strict command and control worked brilliantly in interceptions, but poorly in fluid, low-altitude engagements. The advisors felt frustration, not at the MiG-21 itself, which performed admirably, but at the doctrine surrounding it. One advisor slammed his notebook shut after a debrief and muttered, "We designed a sword and taught them to use it like a hammer." This realization planted a seed that would grow over the next decade, especially when Soviet advisors would later observe MiG-21s facing fully realized F-5E Tiger IIs in Africa. The question now became unavoidable. Was it probably the aircraft or the mindset behind it? While Vietnam provided the first cracks, the lesson truly crystallized years later during the Ogaden War, 1977 to 1978. In the Horn of Africa, on July 23, 1977, Ethiopian airfields buzzed with urgency as Soviet and Cuban advisors prepared briefing rooms under blazing sun near Dire Dawa. This time, the opposing sides were clear. Ethiopian MiG-21s versus Somali F-5E Tiger IIs. Unlike Vietnam, both aircraft now represented mature doctrines. Soviet advisors felt confident again, until the first engagements shattered their assumptions. Ethiopian pilots, flying Soviet jets, reported difficulty keeping the F-5E in their sights during turning engagements. One Ethiopian captain exclaimed during debrief, "They vanish, reappear, and strike from angles we did not expect." Advisors noted the Tiger II's superb visibility, forgiving handling and pilot-centric cockpit. Emotions ran hot: irritation, disbelief, and grudging respect. Colonel Melnikov, now older and visibly wearier, wrote, "The Tiger is not powerful, but it is clever, and clever aircraft favor clever pilots." This was no longer theory. This was proof written in contrails and wreckage. Viewer question: can a simpler aircraft defeat a more advanced one if the pilot has more freedom? As weeks passed, Soviet advisors conducted painstaking after-action reviews. They mapped engagements minute by minute, overlaying radar data with pilot testimony. What disturbed them most was consistency. F-5E pilots survived encounters even when outnumbered. Their aircraft forgave mistakes. The MiG-21 did not. Advisors observed Ethiopian pilots hesitating, waiting for ground instructions, while F-5E pilots acted decisively. One Soviet analyst reportedly said, "Their pilot thinks first. Ours asks permission." Emotionally, this cut deep. The MiG-21 was a national symbol, a triumph of Soviet engineering. But combat exposed an imbalance between machine and doctrine. Advisors began recommending changes: more autonomous pilot training, better situational awareness, improved cockpit ergonomics. Some recommendations were quietly shelved. Others would later influence aircraft like the MiG-29. Yet in that moment, watching African skies burn orange at dusk, many advisors felt a rare emotion in Cold War culture: humility. They had learned something, not from defeat alone, but from comparison. And that lesson echoed loudly. Technology matters, but freedom decides outcomes. By late 1978, Soviet internal memoranda circulated with unusually candid language. Analysts acknowledged that Western light fighters like the F-5E exploited human factors better than Soviet interceptors. Advisors described pilots emotionally connecting with their aircraft, trusting it to recover, to respond intuitively. One memo read, "The enemy aircraft behaves like a partner, not a machine." For advisors trained in rigid hierarchy, this was almost heretical. During a closed-door session in Moscow, a senior general reportedly asked, "Are you saying we should let pilots think for themselves?" Silence followed. Outside the room, snow fell softly, unaware that doctrine itself was shifting. The advisors, who had once dismissed Western designs as inferior, now carried the weight of revelation. They had seen MiG-21s push to their limits, and seen where those limits mattered less than mindset. Viewer question: should military doctrine evolve around technology or around people? The emotional arc is clear. Soviet advisors did not lose these encounters, but they did lose certainty. The MiG-21 remained deadly, fast, and iconic. Yet facing aircraft philosophies embodied by the F-5E Tiger II forced a reckoning. Advisors learned that air combat was no longer about speed alone. It was about awareness, flexibility, and trust in the pilot. Colonel Melnikov's final field note from Africa summarized it best: "We taught them to obey. They taught theirs to adapt." And with that realization, the Cold War's aerial chessboard subtly shifted. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Cold War air combat, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic aviation history and untold military stories. As 1977 drew to a close, Soviet advisors stationed in Ethiopia began to notice something that no radar plot could capture: the emotional state of pilots before and after combat. At airfields near Asmara Air Base, MiG-21 pilots returned tense, often silent, removing their helmets slowly as if still listening for threats. Meanwhile, intelligence reports describing Somali F-5E Tiger II pilots told a different story: confidence, adaptability, even calm humor during debriefs. One Soviet advisor, Captain Yuri Sokolov, recorded in a private letter never meant for official channels, "Our pilots fly as if the aircraft is judging them. Their pilots fly as if the aircraft forgives them." This emotional contrast disturbed him deeply. The MiG-21 demanded precision, Mistakes were punished harshly. The Tiger II, though lighter and less powerful, allowed recovery, experimentation, and second chances. Advisors began to understand that air combat was psychological warfare as much as mechanical performance. Fear shortened decision-making cycles. Confidence expanded them. During one tense debrief, an Ethiopian pilot slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Tell me what to do faster, or let me decide." No one answered. The advisors exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing a collision of two philosophies. Not just East versus West, but control versus trust. Viewer question: would you fight better under strict orders or personal responsibility? The Soviet presence in these conflicts was officially denied, yet deeply influential. Advisors embedded themselves quietly, observing from control vans and concrete bunkers, watching radar blips merge and separate like predatory animals circling. On August 17, 1977, during a particularly intense engagement near Dire Dawa, a MiG-21 pilot pursued an F-5E into a low-altitude turning fight. Precisely the scenario Soviet manuals warned against. The Tiger II reversed faster, bled less energy, and escaped. In the control room, silence fell. One advisor whispered, "This should not be possible." But it was, and it kept happening. These moments carried emotional weight far beyond statistics. Every unexpected escape felt like an accusation against doctrine itself. Advisors began privately asking questions they would never voice publicly. Had Soviet engineers optimized for the wrong war? Had they underestimated the human factor? Colonel Melnikov later admitted in an unpublished interview, "We designed our aircraft to win wars imagined by generals. The Tiger was designed to survive wars flown by pilots." That realization struck hard. It wasn't that the MiG-21 failed. It excelled at what it was designed to do. The problem was that the battlefield had changed, and the rules had not. Viewer question: when reality changes, how fast should doctrine follow? Back in Southeast Asia, similar conclusions were forming years earlier, though they went largely unacknowledged at the time. During late 1968, Soviet advisors in Vietnam analyzed engagements where MiG-21 pilots survived only by breaking from ground control interception and relying on instinct. One North Vietnamese ace famously told a Soviet handler, "If I wait for instructions, I die." That sentence reportedly never appeared in official reports, but it circulated quietly among advisors. Emotionally, these words lingered. They suggested that survival depended not on obedience, but adaptability. Advisors found themselves torn between loyalty to doctrine and loyalty to the pilots they trained. One advisor confessed over vodka during a rare off-duty moment. "We teach them perfection, but combat rewards imperfection handled quickly." That internal conflict haunted many of them long after their tours ended. The F-5E, though not present in Vietnam in its final form, represented the culmination of lessons Western air forces had already learned, lessons the Soviets were now painfully rediscovering through observation rather than innovation. Viewer question: is it better to learn from your own combat or your enemy's success? By 1978, emotional fatigue among Soviet advisors was unmistakable. They were no longer just technicians. They were witnesses to the erosion of certainty. Watching MiG-21 struggle in scenarios they were never meant to fight forced advisors to confront an uncomfortable truth. No aircraft exists in isolation from the doctrine that shapes its use. The F-5E Tiger II was not feared for its weapons load or speed, but for how naturally it fit the pilot. One Soviet evaluation described it almost begrudgingly. The aircraft encourages confidence. In Soviet military culture, encouragement was not a design goal. Control was, precision was, predictability was. Yet combat favored pilots who could react instantly to chaos. Advisors felt admiration mixed with resentment. One Cuban liaison officer joked darkly, "The Tiger fights like a boxer. The MiG fights like a missile." The metaphor stuck. Missiles were deadly, but only if fired correctly. Boxers adapted. Viewer question: which would you rather be in a fight? Perfectly programmed or endlessly adaptable? These realizations did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a slow accumulation of unease. Each engagement added weight. Each debrief added tension. Advisors began quietly recommending changes: better visibility, improved pilot ergonomics, reduced reliance on ground vectors. Many of these suggestions were softened, reworded, or delayed before reaching Moscow. Emotionally, this was exhausting. To admit doctrine needed change was to admit decades of certainty might be incomplete. Colonel Melnikov later described the feeling as watching a crack spread across a statue you were taught to worship. Yet the crack could not be ignored. The Tiger II had exposed not a weakness in Soviet engineering, but blind spot in Soviet philosophy. Viewer question: how many warnings does a system need before it listens? As the Ogaden war wound down in early 1978, Soviet advisors prepared to leave Africa, packing notebooks heavy with questions and answers. They had seen MiG-21s perform heroically and still be outmaneuvered. They had watched pilots succeed only when they broke free from rigid command structures. Emotionally, there was no triumph in these observations, only clarity. One advisor wrote in his final report, "The future fighter must trust his pilot as much as his engineer." This sentence would quietly echo through Soviet design bureaus in the years ahead. At the time, however, it remained just ink on paper. The advisors boarded transport aircraft knowing they carried dangerous knowledge. Dangerous not because it was false, but because it was true. Viewer question: what happens when truth threatens tradition? When Soviet advisors watched MiG-21s face the combat philosophy embodied by the F-5E Tiger II, they learned lessons no exercise could teach. Speed without flexibility was fragile. Control without trust was brittle. Doctrine without adaptation was obsolete. Colonel Melnikov's final diary entry from 1978 captured it best. "We did not lose the sky. We lost our illusion of certainty." That loss would reshape everything that followed. If you want to see how these hard-earned lessons transformed Soviet fighter design and changed the balance of Cold War air power, subscribe for more in-depth aviation history. By January 1979, deep inside the gray concrete corridors of Soviet Air Force headquarters in Moscow, the mood had shifted from confidence to contemplation. Advisors returning from Ethiopia and Southeast Asia were no longer delivering triumphant briefings filled with statistics and kill ratios. Instead, they brought stories of hesitation, improvisation, and uncomfortable admiration for Western combat philosophy. On a cold morning, snow collecting silently outside tall windows, Colonel Sergei Ivanovich Melnikov stood before a panel of senior officers and spoke words rarely heard in Soviet military halls. "Comrades, our aircraft performs as designed. Our doctrine does not." The room stiffened. This was not a technical failure being discussed. It was a philosophical one. Advisors presented combat reconstructions showing MiG-21 pilots entering engagements with superior speed, only to lose positional advantage to slower but more flexible F-5E Tiger II pilots. Emotions ran beneath the surface. Frustration from younger analysts, quiet resistance from senior commanders. One general reportedly muttered, "Speed wins wars." An advisor replied, "Only if the pilot can decide how to use it." For the first time, Soviet leadership confronted the idea that centralized control, once a strength, had become a liability. Viewer question: can a system built for certainty survive an age of uncertainty? The post-war analysis teams worked relentlessly throughout 1979, reconstructing every known engagement involving MiG-21s and F-5Es. They studied radar logs, cockpit audio, gun camera footage, and pilot debriefs. What emerged was a pattern that disturbed planners deeply. F-5E pilots consistently shortened their decision loops. They acted, adjusted, and reacted faster, not because they were braver, but because their doctrine allowed it. One internal report concluded bluntly, "Western pilots are trained to solve problems. Ours are trained to execute solutions." Emotionally, this struck at the heart of Soviet military identity. Advisors who had once taken pride in discipline now saw its unintended consequences. During a closed seminar, an analyst posed a quiet but devastating question. What happens when a solution no longer fits a problem? Silence followed. The F-5Es design, excellent cockpit visibility, forgiving flight envelope, intuitive handling, amplified pilot confidence. The MiG-21, by contrast, demanded obedience and precision. Mistakes were fatal. Advisors realized they had unintentionally created pilots who feared deviation more than defeat. That fear showed up in combat hesitation. The Tiger II punished hesitation mercilessly. Viewer question: is discipline still strength when it prevents adaptation? One of the most emotionally charged moments came during a debrief reconstruction of a September 1977 engagement near Dire Dawa. Ethiopian MiG-21 pilots had followed textbook interception procedures perfectly. Altitude, speed, vectoring, all correct. Yet Somali F-5E pilots broke formation, split vertically, and re-entered the fight from unexpected angles. The MiGs disengaged low on fuel without firing a single effective shot. Watching the replay months later, a young Soviet engineer whispered, "They flew like they were thinking." That sentence echoed uncomfortably through the room. Advisors began to understand that the F-5E's true weapon was not its cannon or missiles. It was trust between pilot and machine. A veteran advisor admitted privately, "We feared chaos so much that we forgot war is chaos." Emotionally, this realization stung. Soviet aviation culture prized control because it feared unpredictability. But unpredictability had become the battlefield's defining trait. Viewer question: can you control chaos, or must you learn to move within it? By late 1979, the lessons could no longer be ignored. Recommendations flowed toward design bureaus like McCoy and Gurevich Design Bureau, though often softened in language to avoid political backlash. Advisors called for improved pilot visibility, relaxed flight stability, better ergonomics, and, most controversially, training that encouraged independent decision-making. One memo concluded with a sentence that would quietly change Soviet aviation history: the next fighter must be built around the pilot, not above him. Emotionally, this marked a turning point. The MiG-21 had been a product of its era: fast, deadly, obedient. The F-5E Tiger II represented a different future: adaptive, forgiving, human-centered. Soviet advisors had learned this lesson the hard way, through observation rather than victory. As one advisor later reflected, "We went to teach. We returned having learned." Subscribe for more deep-dive Cold War aviation history, because the most important battles are often fought inside briefing rooms, not the sky. By early 1980, the emotional weight of the conclusions drawn from Ethiopia and Vietnam began to surface in places far removed from the battlefield: classrooms, simulators, and design review halls. At a Soviet flight academy outside Krasnodar, instructors quietly adjusted how they taught air combat maneuvering. Official manuals remained unchanged, but spoken guidance shifted. One instructor reportedly told his students, "If the book fails you, survive first and explain later." This sentence would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The shadow of encounters with F-5E Tiger II loomed large, even if the name was rarely spoken aloud. Soviet advisors had learned that rigid perfection created brittle pilots. Emotionally, this realization carried guilt. Many instructors felt they had failed earlier generations by suppressing initiative. One senior trainer admitted privately, "We trained obedience because it was safe for us, not for them." That admission marked a quiet revolution. Viewer question: can institutional change begin with whispers instead of orders? Meanwhile, inside design bureaus, engineers revisited long-held assumptions. Combat reports repeatedly emphasized pilot workload, visibility, and reaction time. Designers studying the MiG-21 acknowledged that its cockpit reflected an era where pilots were extensions of ground control. In contrast, Western fighters prioritized human-machine interaction. One engineer reviewing African combat notes scribbled in the margin, "Why does our pilot feel like a passenger?" The emotional discomfort this sparked was real. Soviet aviation culture prided itself on mathematical certainty, yet war revealed that humans did not operate mathematically under stress. Engineers began arguing, not about speed or thrust, but about sightlines, control harmony, and pilot confidence. These debates were intense, sometimes heated. One meeting reportedly ended with a designer slamming his fist on the table and shouting, "If the pilot cannot see, nothing else matters." Viewer question: should technology adapt to humans, or humans to technology? Combat psychology emerged as an unexpected focal point. Advisors returning from Africa described MiG pilots entering engagements already tense, mentally overloaded by instructions and expectations. F-5E pilots, by contrast, were reported to feel inside the fight, not subordinate to it. Soviet psychologists embedded in Air Force research units began studying stress responses and decision paralysis. Their findings were unsettling. Under pressure, pilots trained for autonomy made faster, better choices, even when those choices were imperfect. One report concluded, confidence reduces reaction delay more effectively than training volume. Emotionally, this cut deep. Soviet doctrine valued repetition and precision, but repetition without flexibility bred hesitation. Advisors began pushing for training that embraced uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Viewer question, is confidence something that can be trained or only allowed? The institutional resistance to these ideas was fierce. Senior commanders who had built careers on interceptor doctrine viewed autonomy as chaos. During a heated 1980 conference in Moscow, one general reportedly barked, "A pilot who thinks is a pilot who disobeys." The reply came quietly from an advisor who had watched African skies firsthand. "A pilot who does not think is already dead." The room fell silent. Emotionally, this confrontation symbolized a generational divide. Younger officers, shaped by observed combat realities, leaned toward reform. Older leadership clung to certainty. Yet the data was relentless. Every reconstructed engagement reinforced the same truth. The modern air battle was too fluid for rigid control. Viewer question, when evidence contradicts tradition, which should yield? Behind closed doors, compromises began forming. Official doctrine would not change overnight, but implementation would. Training syllabi quietly expanded free maneuver exercises. Ground controllers were taught when not to speak. Pilots were encouraged to narrate their thought processes during debriefs rather than recite procedures. One instructor described the shift as teaching pilots to explain decisions, not excuses. Emotionally, this reframing mattered. It validated initiative without undermining discipline. Advisors who had once felt powerless now sensed momentum. One wrote in his diary, "The lesson was painful, but it is finally being heard." Viewer question, can slow change still be meaningful change? The shadow of the F-5E Tiger II continued to influence thinking even as newer Western aircraft emerged. To Soviet analysts, the Tiger symbolized a philosophy more than a threat. It represented trust in the pilot, simplicity in design, and adaptability under pressure. One analyst famously summarized it as an aircraft that assumes the pilot will be clever. Emotionally, this challenged Soviet self-image. Had they underestimated human ingenuity in favor of system reliability? Advisors began reframing the narrative, not East versus West, but system versus human. Viewer question, which wins in the long run? Perfect systems or adaptable people? By 1981, the accumulated lessons began influencing decisions that would shape the next generation of fighters. Requirements drafted for future aircraft emphasized agility, situational awareness, and pilot survivability. Engineers were instructed to design for recovery, not just performance. This phrasing directly reflected combat observations where F-5E pilots survived mistakes that MiG-21 pilots could not. Emotionally, this felt like vindication for advisors who had endured years of quiet frustration. One advisor remarked to a colleague, "They finally listened, but only after the sky taught them." Viewer question, why does real change often require real pain? The cultural shift extended beyond aircraft. Pilot selection criteria evolved. Evaluators began valuing adaptability, spatial awareness, and problem-solving under stress. Rigid obedience alone was no longer sufficient. This transition was emotionally complex. Some pilots thrived. Others struggled, conditioned by years of strict hierarchy. One training officer admitted, "We are untraining fear." That sentence captured the heart of the transformation. Fear of deviation had been institutionalized. Now it had to be undone. Viewer question, can fear be trained out as effectively as it was trained in? Looking back, advisors recognized the irony. The Soviet Union had entered these conflicts to demonstrate strength, yet emerged with humility. Observing MiG-21s face F-5E Tigers force a reckoning no exercise could simulate. The lessons were not about losing. They were about learning too late. Advisors carried this understanding with quiet urgency. One final report concluded, "Air combat has become a contest of minds before machines." Emotionally, this reframed everything they thought they knew. Viewer question: if war is a contest of minds, who should doctrine serve first? The Soviet system had not collapsed, but it cracked, letting in new ideas shaped by hard observation. Advisors who once believed doctrine was immutable now understood it as living, vulnerable, and dependent on people. The MiG-21 versus F-5E encounters had done more than compare aircraft. They exposed a philosophical fault line. As one advisor wrote in 1982, "We learned that the future does not belong to the fastest aircraft, but to the pilot allowed to survive long enough to think." Subscribe for more in-depth aviation history and Cold War stories where doctrine, technology, and human courage collide. By 1982, the lessons Soviet advisors had gathered from watching MiG-21 face aircraft like the F-5E Tiger II were no longer whispered footnotes. They had become unavoidable truths shaping the future. Inside secure facilities of the McCoy and Gurevich Design Bureau, engineers and military planners faced a rare moment of honesty. Combat had spoken more clearly than theory. The skies over Vietnam and Ethiopia had exposed a reality Soviet doctrine was never designed for. Modern air combat was chaotic, fast, and deeply human. One senior engineer reportedly opened a design meeting by saying, "If our next fighter needs permission to think, it will already be obsolete." The emotional gravity of that statement lingered. For the first time since the early Cold War, the Soviet Union was designing not just to counter Western technology, but to counter Western philosophy. Advisors who once felt ignored now found their field reports cited in requirement documents. The question driving every discussion was simple yet radical. What if the pilot mattered more than the system? Viewer question: can a superpower admit it learned something from its rival? The answer began to take shape in steel, wires, and aerodynamic curves. Early concept drafts emphasized agility at low and medium altitudes, precisely where MiG-21s had struggled against more forgiving Western fighters. Designers studied why F-5E pilots survived mistakes and asked how to replicate that advantage without sacrificing Soviet strengths. Visibility became a priority. Control harmony mattered. Engineers debated relaxed stability, a concept once considered reckless. Emotionally, this was uncomfortable territory. One veteran designer objected loudly, "Unstable aircraft are dangerous." A younger engineer replied, "Only if the pilot cannot control them." That exchange symbolized a generational shift. The advisor's observations, once seen as criticism, now serve as blueprints. The future fighter would not just intercept. It would fight, adapt, and survive. Viewer question: is innovation born from confidence or from discomfort? By 1983, prototypes that would become the MiG-29 began reflecting those hard-earned lessons. The aircraft was agile, visually dominant in the cockpit, and designed for close-in combat where pilot judgment mattered most. Soviet test pilots immediately noticed the difference. One reportedly said after his first flight, "This aircraft listens." That single sentence marked a philosophical breakthrough. Unlike the MiG-21, which demanded strict adherence to parameters, the MiG-29 responded intuitively. Advisors who attended early demonstrations felt something rare: vindication. Years earlier, they had watched F-5Es outmaneuver MiGs not because they were superior machines, but because they empowered pilots. Now, for the first time, Soviet aviation was doing the same. Viewer question: can a machine be designed to trust a human? Pilot training evolved alongside the aircraft. By 1984, new syllabi encouraged independent tactical decision-making. Instructors allowed students to fail safely, something unheard of a decade earlier. One trainer explained it bluntly: "Better to fail here than freeze there." The emotional impact on pilots was profound. Younger aviators felt liberated. Older ones felt unsettled. Ground controllers were retrained to support rather than command. Advisors who had once watched pilots hesitate in combat now observed them speaking confidently during debriefs, explaining why they made decisions instead of apologizing for them. This shift traced directly back to lessons learned watching F-5E pilots act without permission and survive. Viewer question: is confidence something you can teach or something you must allow? International air shows in the mid-1980s revealed the transformation to the world. When the MiG-21 debuted publicly, Western analysts were surprised, not just by performance, but by its philosophy. Close and agility, helmet-mounted sights, and pilot-centric design signaled a departure from pure interceptor thinking. Quietly, some Western observers acknowledged the irony. One NATO analyst reportedly remarked, "They built a fighter that thinks like ours." Emotionally, Soviet advisors felt a complicated pride. This aircraft was not an imitation. It was an evolution forged by hard lessons. Lessons learned not in triumph, but in observation. Viewer question: is learning from your rival weakness or wisdom? Looking back, advisors recognized that the MiG-21 versus F-5 encounters had never been about wins or losses. They were about exposure. Exposure to a different way of thinking about war. The F-5E Tiger II, modest on paper, had forced a superpower to reconsider decades of assumptions. One retired advisor later reflected, "We feared their technology. We should have studied their trust." That sentence captured the emotional core of the transformation. Technology could be copied. Philosophy had to be learned. Viewer question: what matters more in war, what you build or how you think? By the late 1980s, the ripple effects extended beyond aircraft. Soviet air doctrine emphasized flexibility, decentralized execution, and pilot initiative. These ideas, once controversial, became necessary. Advisors who had once hidden their observations now spoke openly. The system had not abandoned discipline, but it had redefined it. Discipline now meant preparation for uncertainty. Emotionally, this shift felt like closure. One advisor wrote in his final journal entry before retirement, "The sky taught us humility. We finally listened." Viewer question: do institutions change because they want to or because they must? As the Cold War neared its end, the legacy of those early encounters remained quietly embedded in Soviet and later Russian aviation thinking. The MiG-29 stood as proof that lessons learned from rivals could strengthen, not weaken, identity. The advisors who once watched radar scopes in Hanoi and Dire Dawa had helped reshape the future without ever firing a shot. Emotionally, their role was bittersweet. They were witnesses, not heroes. But history often turns on witnesses. Viewer question: how many turning points happen without headlines? The final irony is perhaps the most striking. The MiG-21, once a symbol of Soviet certainty, became the catalyst for doubt, and doubt became the seed of progress. The F-5E Tiger II never intended to change Soviet doctrine, did so simply by surviving and thriving under human control. One advisor summarized it perfectly: they did not defeat us, they educated us. Viewer question: can education be the most powerful weapon of all? When Soviet advisors watched MiG-21s face aircraft built around pilot trust, they learned that air combat is not a contest of machines, but minds operating machines under fear, stress, and uncertainty. The future belonged not to the fastest jet, but to the pilot allowed to think, adapt, and recover. That realization reshaped fighters, training, and doctrine, and echoed far beyond the Cold War. If you enjoyed this full documentary series on Cold War air combat, subscribe for more deep, human-focused military history that goes beyond the headlines.